Hello, welcome back to MOOC course on Environmental Humanities. This is lecture number 15 and you are in week 3rd. In the previous discussions so far, we have explored various dimensions of climate fiction. We examined how literary texts represent environmental crisis, connect domestic experiences with planetary change, employ satire and irony as forms of environmental critique, and move between intimate and large-scale perspectives to communicate ecological concerns. Today we arrive at the final topic of 3rd week. Our focus will be on narrative voice and ecological anxiety, two concepts that bring together many of the themes discussed throughout this week. I have many times said that climate change is not experienced only through environmental events and ecological transformations. It also affects emotions, perceptions, and ways of understanding the future. Feelings of uncertainty, fear, vulnerability, and concern increasingly appear in contemporary climate fiction, reflecting the emotional impact of environmental crisis. Writers use narrative voice and narrative structure to communicate these experiences in powerful ways. Through different perspectives, storytelling techniques, and forms of narration, climate fiction helps readers engage emotionally and ethically with environmental issues. So, this lecture will allow us to reflect on how literary form shapes our understanding. It's a kind of summary and a revisiting on the previous lectures also, and to provide you a fresh perspective also, because we are focusing on emotion, narrative, and environmental awareness. So, climate fiction, as we said, not only represents environmental crisis but also explores its emotional and psychological effects. As environmental concerns become increasingly visible in our society, literature has started to examine how individuals and communities respond to ecological uncertainty. So, one term that has emerged out of this is ecological anxiety. This term refers to feelings of fear, stress, uncertainty, and concern associated with environmental degradation and climate change. Such emotions are becoming increasingly relevant in both everyday life and literary representation. Climate fiction often portrays these experiences through characters who confront environmental disruption, ecological instability, and uncertain futures. So, while this is happening, literature therefore transforms climate change from a distant environmental issue into a experience of our daily life, our own experience. So, at the same time, these emotional responses are shaped by the way the stories are told, the way narrative voice influences how readers perceive events, connect with the characters, and interpret environmental concerns. Similarly, narrative structure affects the pace, intensity, and emotional impact of climate narratives. The text that we discussed, they demonstrate how literary techniques help communicate ecological anxiety while also encouraging ethical reflection on environmental issues. So, we have these ideas in mind today. Let us first examine the concept of ecological anxiety and explore how it is represented in the selected fiction texts. Let us consider this idea, ecological anxiety, which refers to the feelings of fear, uncertainty, stress, and concern that arise from the awareness of environmental degradation. That we are upset, we fear, we are scared. So, unlike a sudden fear triggered by an immediate danger, ecological anxiety often develops gradually as individuals become conscious of long-term environmental threats and their possible consequences. Climate fiction frequently explores these emotional responses by showing how environmental instability affects both individuals and societies. Through narrative, readers are encouraged not only to understand environmental problems but also to experience the emotional weight associated with them. In the novel, The Stone Gods, ecological anxiety emerges through the repeated destruction of worlds and civilizations. The novel presents societies that continue harmful patterns of behavior despite recognizing the consequences of their actions. This recurring cycle of ecological collapse creates a sense of frustration and unease, raising concerns about humanity's inability to learn from past mistakes. Readers become aware of a future that appears trapped within a pattern of environmental failure. A different form of ecological anxiety appears in flight behavior. Here, environmental concern is communicated through the unexpected migration of monarch butterflies. What initially appears to be a remarkable natural event gradually becomes a sign of environmental disruption. As characters attempt to understand these changes, the novel reflects uncertainty about climate change and the unpredictability of ecological systems. Both texts demonstrate that ecological anxiety is closely linked to awareness. The more individuals recognize environmental instability, the more they are forced to confront difficult questions about the future and humanity's relationship with nature. These emotional responses take different forms in so many novels, and we can discuss the other two novels that we have been continuously talking here. The experiences of ecological anxiety explored in the Rapture and the Hungry Tide as well. And they do it in a different way. Because in the Rapture, ecological anxiety is intensified through the possibility of large scale environmental catastrophe. The narrative is shaped by apocalyptic visions, predictions of disaster, and a growing sense that environmental collapse may be approaching. These elements create an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty, affecting both individual characters and the society around them. The anxiety experienced in the novel is not limited to concern about nature, it also involves fear of social breakdown, instability, and a very, very unpredictable future. And that is what emerges in The Hungry Tide as well, but in a different form. Rather than focusing on a single catastrophic event, the novel presents anxiety as a part of everyday life within a vulnerable ecological landscape. Because the people who live in the Sundarbans, they live in constant interaction with tides, storms, wildlife, and changing environmental conditions. Their dependence on a fragile ecosystem creates ongoing uncertainty regarding survival, livelihood, and security. What makes these texts particularly significant is that they show ecological anxiety as both personal and collective experience. Individuals may feel fear, concern, or uncertainty, but these emotions are also connected to larger environmental realities affecting entire communities and ecosystems. Together, these novels reveal that ecological anxiety can emerge through many different narrative situations, whether expressed through environmental disruption, recurring ecological collapse, apocalyptic fears, or ecological vulnerability. These texts demonstrate the emotional impact of living in an age of environmental uncertainty. So, we have explored how ecological anxiety is represented in climate. We can now consider why this concept has become such an important aspect of contemporary environmental humanities. One reason ecological anxiety is important is that it transforms climate change from purely scientific issue into an emotional and ethical experience. Scientific reports can provide information about environmental problems, but literature allows readers to engage with feelings, concerns, and uncertainties associated with those problems. Through narratives, climate change becomes something that is experienced, felt, realized, uh, than simply observed. Ecological anxiety also helps readers understand that environmental crisis affects more than ecosystems alone. It influences the way people think about themselves, their communities, and their futures. Questions about environmental stability responsibility, and survival become part of everyday consciousness, shaping human behavior, decision making. Another significant aspect of ecological anxiety is its ability to humanize climate change. Environmental discussions often rely on statistics, scientific data, and large scale projections. While these are important, they can sometimes feel very mechanical, very theoretical, very textual. Climate fiction brings these concerns into the realm of lived experience, allowing readers to connect environmental issues with emotions, relationships, and personal realities. Through characters and narratives, readers encounter the emotional consequences of environmental disruption. They witness uncertainty, fear, hope, and resilience, making environmental crisis more immediate and relatable. For these reasons, ecological anxiety has become a central feature of contemporary climate fiction. It helps bridge the gap between environmental knowledge and the human experience, encouraging deeper engagement with the ecological concerns. Its significance, however, extends beyond emotional engagement alone. Ecological anxiety also influences the way stories are structured and the kinds of questions they encourage readers to ask. Let us explore these additional functions in further. Ecological anxiety also plays an important role in shaping the narrative and ethical dimensions of climate fiction. One of its key functions is the creation of narrative urgency. Feelings of fear, uncertainty, and instability often drive the movement of the story and influence how characters respond to environmental challenges. As ecological concerns become more pressing, narratives develop a stronger sense of tension and anticipation. Readers become invested not only in what is happening but also in what might happen next. Ecological anxiety also encourages critical reflection. Many climate fiction texts invite readers to question assumptions about progress, development, consumption, and humanity's relationship with nature. Rather than presenting environmental crisis as an unavoidable event, these narratives encourage examination of the social, cultural, and economic systems that contribute to ecological degradation. And one more important function is the creation of ethical awareness. So, climate fiction frequently raises questions about responsibility toward the environment, future generations, and vulnerable communities affected by ecological change. Through the emotional experience of characters, readers are encouraged to reflect on their own relationship with environmental issues and consider the ethical implication of human actions. In this way, ecological anxiety becomes more than an emotional response. It functions as a literary tool that connects environmental awareness with ethical responsibility and social critique. As we move forward, it is important to consider how these emotions are communicated within the narrative itself. This brings us to the role of narrative voice and the ways in which storytelling techniques help represent environmental crisis. So far, we have examined ecological anxiety as an important emotional and ethical dimension of climate fiction. The next question is how writers communicate these feelings to readers. One of the most effective tools for doing so is narrative voice. Narrative voice shapes the way readers experience events, understand characters, and interpret environmental concerns. It determines not only what is told, but also how it is told. Through narrative voice, environmental crisis becomes a lived and emotional experience rather than a distant or abstract issue, as well as something which is told by a person or a voice that matters. In The Rapture, the novel employs a psychologically intense narrative voice that conveys fear, uncertainty, and prophetic urgency. Environmental catastrophe is not presented merely as an external event, it is filtered through personal experience and emotional perception. As a result, readers encounter ecological crisis in an immediate and deeply personal way. Narrative voice can also bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and emotional understanding. This is particularly evident in flight behavior. This novel combines scientific discussions of climate change with the experiences of ordinary individuals. Through its narrative focus, readers are able to connect environmental facts with human emotions, making complex ecological issues more accessible and meaningful. In both texts, narrative voice serves as a bridge between environmental realities and human experience. It helps transform scientific concerns into stories that readers can relate to emotionally and ethically. However, narrative voice can perform additional functions as well. It can create distance, expose contradictions, and reveal environmental vulnerability in ways that deepen our understanding of climate crisis. Now let us explore these dimensions. Narrative voice does more than create emotional connection. It can also challenge readers, expose contradictions, and reveal the complexities of environmental crisis through different storytelling techniques. One important strategy is the use of irony and fragmentation in the Stone Gods. The narrative shifts across different times, places, and perspectives. These shifts create a fragmented reading experience that mirrors the recurring cycles of ecological destruction depicted in the novel. The often ironic narrative voice highlights the contradiction between humanity's technological achievements and its repeated environmental failures. Readers are encouraged to recognize patterns of behavior that continue despite clear warnings and historical experience. A different function of narrative voice appears in The Hungry Tide. Here, the fluid movement between perspectives allows readers to experience the interconnected lives of people, animals, and ecosystems rather than presenting environmental issues from a single viewpoint. The novel reveals multiple experiences and forms of knowledge. This approach amplifies a sense of vulnerability and precarity. The narrative constantly reminds readers that both human communities and natural ecosystems are exposed to environmental uncertainty. By connecting personal experiences with ecological realities, the novel creates empathy and highlights the interdependence between human and the natural world. So, both these texts demonstrate that narrative voice is not simply a method of telling a story, it is an important literary strategy that shapes emotional responses, ethical reflection, and environmental awareness. So, now we have explored the role of narrative voice. Now, we can examine a related concept, and that is narrative mediation, and consider how it helps shape ethical understanding within climate fiction. Narrative mediation refers to the ways in which stories shape our understanding of events, perspectives, and ethical questions. Rather than presenting environmental issues directly, narratives guide readers through particular experiences and viewpoints, influencing how they interpret environmental challenges. Like in The Hungry Tide, the novel presents multiple perspectives, including those of a scientist, a translator, local inhabitants of the Sundarbans. Each perspective offers a different understanding of the environment and its value. As readers move between these viewpoints, they encounter competing concerns such as conservation, livelihood, survival. The novel does not provide a simple solution, but instead encourages readers to reflect on the ethical complexities involved in environmental decision making. And another important example can be found in flight behavior. Through a close focus on the experiences of an individual character, the novel transforms climate change from a large scale environmental issue into a personal and emotional reality. Readers witness environmental change through the protagonist's observations, doubts, and growing awareness. This intimate perspective encourages empathy and helps readers understand how climate crisis affects ordinary lives. In both these novels, narrative mediation functions as a bridge between environmental knowledge and ethical reflection. So rather than instructing readers what to think, the narrative creates experiences what encouraged questioning, empathy, and critical engagement. This process becomes even more significant when narratives experiment with structure, time, perception. Now, let us consider these techniques, how they shape further the ethical awareness. Like in narrative mediation can also operate through more complex storytelling techniques like how readers understand responsibility, time, and environmental crisis. In the Stone Gods, this is achieved through fragmentation and cyclical narrative structures. The novel repeatedly returns to patterns of ecological destruction across different times and locations, suggesting that humanity continues to repeat the same environmental mistakes. By presenting these recurring cycles, the narrative encourages readers to reflect on issues of responsibility, denial, and the failure to learn from the past. The structure itself becomes part of the ethical message, highlighting the consequences of ignoring environmental warnings. And a different form of mediation appears in the rapture. Environmental catastrophe here is often filtered through trauma, fear, and prophetic visions. As readers encounter events through these emotionally charged perspectives, they are encouraged to question how knowledge is understood and acted upon. The novel blurs the boundaries between scientific evidence, personal belief, and emotional experience, creating ethical questions about trust, responsibility, and action in times of crisis. These texts demonstrate that ethical awareness is shaped not only by what stories tell us, but also by how they tell it. Narrative structures, perspectives, and modes of representation influence the way readers think about environmental responsibility and human behavior. Together, whatever we have discussed in this lecture, it shows that narrative mediation plays a crucial role in transforming environmental issues into ethical concerns that demand reflection and engagement. So, having considered the ethical dimensions of narrative form, we can now examine the narrative structure itself, how it influences readers' emotional responses to ecological collapse. The way a story is structured can significantly influence uh, how readers experience environmental crisis. Narrative structure shapes the pace of the story, the flow of information, and the emotional journey of both characters and readers. In climate fiction, structural choices often play an important role in communicating ecological anxiety and environmental uncertainty. In The Stone Gods, the novel employs fragmented timelines and cyclical histories, repeatedly returning to patterns of environmental destruction. Rather than presenting ecological collapse as a single event, the narrative suggests that similar mistakes occur across different places and periods. This repetition creates a sense of inevitability and emotional fatigue, encouraging readers to reflect on humanity's recurring failure to address environmental problems. A very different approach can be seen in the in flight behavior. The novel follows more linear and character-centered structure. Environmental awareness develops gradually alongside the protagonist's understanding of the unusual events taking place around her. Because readers experience this process step by step, they become emotionally involved in the character's journey of discovery and growing concern. These contrasting narrative structures demonstrate that emotional responses are shaped not only by environmental themes but also by the manner in which stories unfold. Some narratives create urgency through disruption and repetitions, while others build emotional engagement through gradual revelation and personal experiences. In both the cases, narrative structure helps readers beyond intellectual understanding and develop a deeper emotional connection with environmental concerns. Other climate fiction texts employ additional structural techniques that generate suspense, uncertainty, and multiple perspectives. The relationship between narrative structure and emotional response becomes even more apparent in The Rapture and The Hungry Tide, where the storytelling techniques create distinct experiences of environmental crisis. In The Rapture, the narrative is shaped by psychological suspense and growing sense of urgency, prophetic visions, environmental instability, and the possibility of catastrophe create constant tension throughout the novel. Readers are placed in a position of anticipation, unsure of what may happen next. This uncertainty mirrors the anxiety associated with the climate change, climate crisis, and encourages emotional engagement with the narrative. And in Hungry Tide, the multiple perspective approach brings various things together, the scientific, social, cultural, ecological viewpoints. And these perspectives highlight the complexity of environmental issues and demonstrate that no single viewpoint can fully explain the ecological reality. So, this polyphonic structure encourages empathy because readers encounter the experiences, concerns, and values of different characters. At the same time, it reveals the interconnected nature of environmental problems, showing how ecological challenges affect individuals and communities in different ways. So, taken together, these texts discussed here in this lecture demonstrate that narrative voice, mediation, and structure are not merely technical aspects of storytelling. And storytelling is something very important that we need constant revisiting in environmental humanities. They play a central role in shaping how readers understand environmental crisis, experience ecological anxiety, and reflect upon questions of responsibility and action. And this particular lecture, the last one of this week, brings together many of the ideas explored throughout this week. So we have seen how climate fiction represents environmental change, examines human responses to ecological crisis, and uses literary techniques to create emotional and ethical engagement with environmental concerns. Before concluding, let us briefly acknowledge the readings and references that have informed our discussion. So these are the primary texts and some critical works. I hope you will enjoy reading them and you will also try reading them. That is very important. That's what the real goal of this whole program is. So thank you very much. I hope I meet you in the different lecture.